He was the quiet kid no one noticed, until his teacher called him to the board to embarrass him. But what started as a public challenge turned into a moment that left the entire class speechless. How did a 13-year-old who never spoke solve a problem no one else could? You'll want to see what happens next. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The morning light poured through the tall windows of Southridge Middle School, casting golden streaks across scuffed linoleum floors and half-zipped backpacks. Autumn in Atlanta meant a mix of crisp air and restless students, and room 207 was no exception. The 8th grade math class buzzed with the sound of squeaking chairs, shuffling papers, and whispered gossip. In the back corner near the window, Elijah Brooks sat alone, his notebook open but barely used. 13 years old, tall for his age but slight in build, Elijah had the kind of quiet presence that let him vanish in plain sight. His dark eyes drifted beyond the classroom walls, following the sway of tree branches and the flicker of light across a chain-link fence. While his classmates traded jokes and half-finished homework answers, Elijah traced invisible formulas across the sky in his mind. It wasn't that he didn't care, he did, deeply. But the slow crawl of lessons, the rote repetition, the dragging pace of textbook examples, it all left him restless. Numbers were his refuge, not his prison. And so, while the assigned problems lay untouched in the center of his page, the margins of his notebook told a different story. Complex equations, logic puzzles, and calculations far beyond his grade level. He solved them in silence, not for praise, but for peace. Elijah didn't raise his hand, didn't volunteer answers, didn't crave attention. He had learned that being invisible was safer, easier. No questions, no expectations. But that safety came at a cost. To the outside world, including his teachers, he looked like a daydreamer, a kid who didn't try, someone sliding through the year unnoticed. And maybe, Elijah thought, that was fine, as long as no one asked him to explain himself, as long as he could keep his mind racing quietly behind a still face. But that illusion, the careful invisibility he had constructed, was about to crack, because on this particular day, in this very room, someone was watching, and soon, Elijah Brooks would be pulled into the light he had tried so hard to avoid. At the front of the room stood Ms. Camille Harper, sleeves rolled neatly to her elbows, a red pen tucked behind one ear like a weapon she never hesitated to draw. A no-nonsense educator with 15 years under her belt, she had the posture of a woman who didn't just command a classroom. She owned it. Her tailored blazer was buttoned, her expression sharp, and as the final bell rang, she stood beside her desk like a judge about to deliver a verdict. In front of her, a tall stack of freshly graded math tests sat like a challenge. The red markings across most of them were harsh, unrelenting, and her patience, already thin from months of lukewarm engagement, was wearing out fast. She had given that test expecting better. Algebra basics, foundational material. Yet more than half the class had stumbled, badly. Ms. Harper didn't tolerate mediocrity, not from herself, and certainly not from the students she believed could do more. She crossed her arms and scanned the room, her eyes darting from face to face until they landed, almost involuntarily, on the quiet boy by the window, Elijah Brooks. He was a contradiction that irritated her. Always present, never disruptive, yet distant. A good test taker, yes, but detached. Detached in a way that made her wonder whether he was skating through or simply uninterested. His silence, his way of slipping through the cracks without drawing attention, bothered her more than open defiance ever could. Especially today. Ms. Harper picked up the first test on the stack. At the top, circled in red ink, was a bold 100%. No errors, no hesitation. The name at the top. Elijah Brooks. Her jaw tightened. It wasn't the first time. He had aced every quiz, every exam. But he never raised his hand, never asked questions, never showed any hunger for more. It gnawed at her, this dissonance between what he could do and what he refused to show. She handed out tests with clipped comments. "You can do better. We'll review this section again. See me after class." But when she reached Elijah's desk, she didn't say a word, just placed the paper face down and moved on, her silence heavier than any remark. Returning to the front of the room, she turned to face the class, arms folded across her chest. "Let's talk," she said, her voice calm but edged. "Because too many of you are treating this like it doesn't matter." Her gaze settled again on Elijah, just for a second. If he thought he could coast unnoticed, he was about to find out otherwise. The air shifted as Ms. Harper leaned against her desk, arms still folded, her tone tightening like a drawstring. "This is basic algebra," she said, letting the weight of her words settle across the room. "If you can't grasp this, you're going to struggle in high school, in college, in life." The class quieted. Chairs squeaked, a cough in the back. Elijah sat still, his eyes drifting back toward the window, where a leaf detached from a branch and spun lazily to the ground. His mind followed it, detached, almost floating, until his name snapped through the air like a rubber band. Elijah Brooks. His head whipped around. The room fell utterly silent. Ms. Harper's gaze was locked on him now, sharp, unblinking. "You seem far more interested in what's happening outside that window than in this class," she said, her voice cutting but controlled. "Why don't you come up here and show us just how well you've been paying attention?" Elijah's stomach dropped. He froze for a second too long. Chairs shifted as his classmates turned toward him. Some smirked. Others whispered. "Let's go," Miss Harper said, motioning to the whiteboard with a marker in her hand. "Come prove me wrong." The scrape of Elijah's chair echoed louder than it should have. His legs felt like wet concrete as he stood. Every step toward the front stretched longer than the last, like walking in a dream that was tilting into a nightmare. His ears burned from the quiet murmurs behind him. "She's gonna roast him," someone muttered. "How you doesn't even know what's going on," another whispered. Ms. Harper stood beside the board, her expression unreadable. She clicked the cap off the marker and wrote out an equation. Not a simple warm-up problem. Not even one from the last unit. This was advanced, layered with fractions, exponents, and multiple variables, far beyond what they had been assigned. She handed him the marker. "Go ahead," she said coolly. "Show us what you've got." The marker felt cold in Elijah's hand. His palms were damp. He stared at the board. The equation loomed like a locked door. Behind him, snickers. "Bet he's gonna fake it." Watch him mess up the first line. His heart pounded, hard and fast, like it was trying to escape his chest. For a moment, he considered retreating, handing the marker back, taking the embarrassment, slipping back into invisibility. But something stopped him. A quiet voice inside, the one that had guided him through those late-night problems, scribbled in the margins, the voice that never needed an audience. "You've done this 100 times. You know how this works." He inhaled slowly, let the noise behind him fade into static, and raised the marker to the board. Elijah stared at the equation, the room behind him blurring into a haze of breathless silence and half-stifled amusement. The board was a battlefield now. Each variable, each symbol, a challenge to prove he didn't belong. His fingers tightened around the marker as he broke the equation down piece by piece in his head. His heart still thudded, but his breathing slowed. He didn't hear the whispers anymore. All he could hear was his own mind. Quiet, focused, clear. He began with the fractions, simplifying what others might have tripped over in confusion. His first strokes on the board were cautious, tentative. He wrote small, clean lines, testing the room, testing himself. No one laughed now. A few eyes narrowed, a couple of students leaned in. He kept going. Step by step, the math unfolded. He cleared parentheses, balanced both sides, isolated variables, rewrote terms with elegant precision. The board began to fill, first the top row, then the next. A girl near the front whispered, "Wait, is he actually doing it?" Another voice, "Yo, that looks right." Even Ms. Harper's posture shifted. She had started this as a lesson in humility, maybe even a public wake-up call, but now her eyes were fixed on his work, tracing each line with growing interest. Her arms slowly lowered, unfolding as if realizing her assumptions were doing the same. Elijah, unaware of the shifting stairs, was in a rhythm now. The math flowed like music, each movement of his hand syncing with the logic of the problem. He didn't hesitate anymore. The problem didn't intimidate him, it energized him. He reached the final step. One last calculation, one final simplification. And then, with a confident, almost defiant flick, he circled the answer. Silence. Not the kind filled with judgment or confusion. This was the silence of people witnessing something they hadn't expected, the kind of silence that follows revelation. Elijah turned slowly, the marker still in his hand. His chest rose and fell in steady waves. He met the eyes of his classmates, many now wide with surprise, some even with admiration. The same students who'd whispered, mocked, doubted, were now stunned into reverence. Ms. Harper approached the board, heels clicking sharply in the quiet. She scanned his solution, finger following each line. Her brow furrowed once, then relaxed. Her lips parted slightly, as if wanting to say something but not yet ready. Finally, she stepped back. "This," she said, her voice softer than usual, "is correct." A ripple passed through the room. At first, just a few claps, tentative, awkward. But then more followed, louder, more genuine, until the sound filled the room. Elijah stood still, flushed, unsure of what to do. It wasn't embarrassment this time. It was something deeper. Pride, a kind he'd never felt in public. He didn't smile, he didn't boast. He just nodded quietly and handed the marker back. But something had changed in that moment, something none of them could unsee. The quiet kid had just done the impossible, and the room would never look at him the same way again. Elijah walked back to his seat in a daze, the applause still echoing faintly in his ears. He wasn't used to this, attention, recognition, eyes. He had spent so long trying to disappear that now, with the entire class watching him, he didn't know where to look. His hands trembled slightly as he picked up his notebook, the familiar weight of it grounding him. He slid into his chair without a word, heart pounding but face composed. It wasn't until he looked up and saw the faces turn toward him, not with mockery, but with respect, that he realized something had shifted, not just in how they saw him, but in how he saw himself. Ms. Harper stood at the front, her gaze still locked on the board, but her mind clearly somewhere deeper. For a long moment she said nothing, letting the final applause taper off. Then, with her arms crossed and voice steadier than before, she turned to the class. "What you just saw wasn't luck," she said plainly. "That was clarity. That was focus. That was what it looks like when someone truly understands the material." She gestured to the board, now filled with Elijah's meticulous steps. Elijah didn't just solve this problem, he took it apart, piece by piece, and showed us exactly how it works. That's not just good math, that's brilliance. There was no sarcasm in her voice, no edge, only admiration. And something else Elijah hadn't expected: humility. He kept his head low, his fingers brushing the edges of his notebook. A part of him wanted to shrink again, to slide back into comfort and quiet. But another part, the part that had stood in front of the board and owned the equation, sat up just a little straighter. Ms. Harper walked slowly toward his desk. Her expression wasn't stern now, it was thoughtful, even kind. "Elijah," she said, her tone gentler, "why haven't you spoken up before? If you can do this, why stay quiet?" The question hung in the air, heavier than the silence that followed. Elijah hesitated. He glanced around, then down at his sneakers. He searched for words that didn't sound like excuses. Finally, he shrugged. "I didn't think anyone noticed," he said quietly. Ms. Harper's face softened. She nodded, the weight of his answer sinking in. "Well," she said, loud enough for the class to hear. "It's time. That changes." From that moment forward, the room no longer saw Elijah Brooks as a background figure. No longer the boy who stared out the window while equations passed him by. He had stepped into the light and left an impression no one could ignore. The bell rang not long after, its shrill cry slicing through the thick air of lingering awe. Students began gathering their things, still whispering, still casting sidelong glances at Elijah. He kept his head down, unsure of how to respond to the new attention. A few students passed him with tentative praise, shoulder taps, murmured, "That was crazy," and "You made that look easy." Elijah offered a soft nod in return, his voice stuck somewhere between disbelief and pride. For so long, the spotlight had been something to avoid. Now, having stood in it, he wasn't sure if he wanted to leave it behind or chase it. "Elijah," Ms. Harper called as the last student filed out. "Can you stay a moment?" He froze, then slowly turned back toward the front. The door shut behind the final classmate, and silence settled over room 207 once more. Ms. Harper leaned against her desk, arms crossed, but her expression wasn't sharp this time. It was contemplative, a little unsure, a little human. "I owe you an apology," she said after a beat. Elijah blinked. He hadn't expected that. She straightened and walked over to the board, her eyes trailing across the clean, brilliant math he'd left behind. "I've been teaching a long time. I like to think I'm good at reading students. But I misread you. I assumed your quiet meant you didn't care, that your silence was disinterest." She turned to him, her voice gentler now. "I was wrong." Elijah didn't know what to say. The idea of an adult, especially Miss Harper, admitting fault felt unreal. But it didn't make him feel smug. It made him feel seen. "I'm not used to people noticing," he said, barely louder than a whisper. "I usually just do it for me." "Well, you've got something rare," she said, her tone serious now, "and I don't want to see you hide it. You have a gift, Elijah, and gifts like yours need room to grow." She reached into her desk and pulled out a flyer. The heading read, "District Enrichment Program Advanced Math Track. There's a class after school twice a week for students like you who need more than what we cover here. I've already spoken to the coordinator. They're excited to meet you." Elijah stared at the paper. Opportunity always seemed like something that belonged to other people, louder people. But now it was right in front of him. And someone believed he deserved it. That evening, Elijah sat at the small kitchen table in the heart of his family's modest home, the flyer Ms. Harper had given him resting beside his half-eaten dinner. The overhead light buzzed softly, casting a warm glow on the wood-grain table where so many quiet nights had passed. Nights spent with his notebook, pencil, and imagination. But tonight was different. Tonight Elijah wasn't working in secret. His mother, Tanya Brooks, leaned forward with her chin resting on her hand, eyes glistening as Elijah recounted everything. How Ms. Harper had called on him, the equation, the applause, the invitation to join the advanced math program. Across from her, Robert Brooks sat with his arms folded, his face serious but proud, nodding thoughtfully as his son spoke. When Elijah finished, there was a pause. A silence not born of discomfort, but of emotion. Tanya reached across the table and took Elijah's hand, her thumb brushing the back of it gently. "We've always known you were special, baby," she said, her voice thick with feeling. "I'm just glad the rest of the world is starting to see it too." Robert nodded, his deep voice steady. "You didn't just solve a math problem today, you stood up. You let them see who you are. That takes courage." Elijah looked down at the flyer, tracing the edge with his finger. "What if I mess up?" he asked quietly. Robert smiled, leaning forward. "Messing up is part of learning, but hiding your gift? That's the only real mistake you can make." Tanya squeezed his hand. "You're not alone in this. We've got your back, always." Elijah exhaled slowly, the fear in his chest softening into something quieter. Not quite certainty, but possibility. He picked up his pencil, flipped open his notebook, and stared at the blank page. Only this time, it didn't feel empty. It felt wide open. The following week, Elijah walked through the tall double doors of Brookhaven Learning Annex, clutching his notebook to his chest like armor. The halls smelled faintly of whiteboard cleaner and new paper, strange but comforting. Around him, students he didn't recognize laughed, whispered, and filed into classrooms with a confidence he didn't yet feel. These were the kids who had always raised their hands, who joined math leagues and science fairs. Elijah wasn't sure if he belonged here yet. His feet carried him into room 12, where a sign on the door read, Advanced Math District, Enrichment Program. Inside, students sat at clustered desks, working through warm-up problems already projected on the board. The instructor, a tall man with salt and pepper hair and a kind smile, greeted Elijah with a nod. "Welcome, Mr. Brooks. Grab any open seat." Elijah sat near the back, instinctively. But as the lesson began, something remarkable happened. As the problems grew harder, dense systems of equations, logic puzzles that bent numbers into riddles, Elijah's nerves began to fade. His pencil moved faster, his mind locked in. The pace was fast, the challenge real. But it felt right. For the first time, he wasn't holding back. He was keeping up. He was engaged. By the end of class, he'd even spoken, once, maybe twice, offering a solution that made two nearby students glance at him with impressed surprise. The instructor nodded thoughtfully, scribbling his method on the board. "Elegant work, Elijah." That phrase stuck with him. As he walked out into the hallway, the buzz of competition and discovery still hanging in the air, he realized something. He did belong here, not just as a student, but as a thinker, a doer, a peer. Outside, the sky had darkened into early evening. The sidewalk shimmered beneath the orange glow of the streetlights. Elijah pulled his notebook from his backpack and opened to a blank page. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel the need to solve a problem in the margins. This page? It was for what came next. Back at Southridge Middle, room 207 no longer felt the same. The kid who once melted into the back row now entered to greetings, nods, even high fives. "Yo, Elijah," someone called from across the room. "You gonna help me on that homework or what?" Another voice chimed in. "Man, that problem you solved was wild. I still don't get how you did it." Elijah gave a modest shrug as he took his usual seat by the window, but the slouched posture was gone. His back was straighter now, his eyes not lost in the branches outside but focused on the board ahead. For the first time, he didn't feel like he had to disappear to survive. He was part of the room now, not its ghost. Even Miss Harper had changed. She entered that morning with her usual purposeful stride, but when her eyes met Elijah's, a subtle smile pulled at the corners of her mouth. She called on him with encouragement now, not challenge, and when he answered, calmly, confidently, the class didn't laugh or whisper. They listened. That afternoon, Miss Harper once again asked him to stay behind. But this time, there was no apology, no tension. "I've been thinking," she said, settling on the edge of her desk, "about where this could go for you. There are summer institutes, competitions, even early college opportunities, and I know you might feel unsure about it all, but I want to help you figure it out. You up for it?" Elijah looked down at his notebook, the cover now worn from constant use. But inside, the pages had changed. Less scribbling in the margins, more structure, more purpose. He looked back up. "Yeah," he said, "I think I am." That evening, he sat again at the kitchen table, pencil in hand, working through a problem he didn't yet understand, but wasn't afraid to tackle. His mom walked by and kissed the top of his head. "I'm proud of you, baby." He smiled, eyes fixed on the page. Because for the first time, Elijah Brooks wasn't just solving for X. He was solving for who he was meant to be. Weeks passed, and the ripples of Elijah Brooks' quiet breakthrough continued to spread, not just through his classroom, but in the way others began to see possibility where once they saw silence. Students who had once overlooked him now leaned in during group work, asking for his insight, not out of pity, but with genuine curiosity. The boy who used to hide in plain sight had become someone they respected, someone they noticed. And Ms. Harper? She had changed too. Elijah's story stayed with her long after that day. It reminded her that brilliance doesn't always raise its hand or speak up from the front row. Sometimes it sits quietly in the back, solving problems in the margins, just waiting for someone to ask the right question. She began reaching out more to the quiet ones, the overlooked ones. Elijah had shifted not just his own future, but the way she taught. One evening, as Elijah sat at the table with his notebook open, his pencil moving steadily across the page, he paused just for a moment. He looked at what he had written. Not a problem someone else had given him, but a problem he'd created. One designed to challenge himself. A symbol of how far he'd come. He smiled softly, because now he wasn't just solving equations. He was writing his future, one line, one number, one brave step at a time. This story is a powerful reminder that brilliance doesn't always shout. It often sits quietly, waiting to be seen. Elijah Brooks showed us that courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the quiet decision to stand up when no one expects you to. In today's world, where quick judgments often overshadow quiet potential, his journey urges us to look deeper, listen more closely, and never underestimate someone based on how softly they speak. Every child deserves the chance to be seen for who they truly are, not just what they appear to be. If this story moved you, inspired you, or reminded you of someone in your life, don't keep it to yourself. Hit the like button, subscribe for more meaningful stories like this one, and share this video with a friend or parent who needs to hear it. Because sometimes, the right story at the right moment can change everything.